and share the screen with you. Okay, so any questions before I start? Anything from the previous lecture? No? All right. So in this Benebu-Tirol paper, this is the framework, just to remind you and recap, that there are three kinds of motivation which agents may have in this framework, right? One is intrinsic motivation. They have a pro-social preference. That's why they want to do generous acts like giving blood or, not littering on the streets or not speeding and so on, paying their taxes. Then there's an extrinsic motivation. There may be rewards and penalties. Rewards for what is socially the good behavior and penalties for the wrong kind of behavior. And there's a third kind of motivation which agents have, which is reputational. They want others to think that they have a strong pro-social motive, that is they're generous people, they are civic-minded people and so on. Yes. And it's the interplay of these three kinds of motives that is the focus of this analysis, right? And as I said before, there are sort of two large points in this paper, two big takeaways. One is the possibility of multiple equilibria, and that's something we covered in the last class. And the second is the more important point, which is the crowding out effect, the possible crowding out effect that sometimes, not always, it may so happen that if the extrinsic motivation is strengthened through increased rewards or penalties, then there's a crowding out effect on intrinsic motivation, in particular the reputational motivation. People's reputation-based reason to do the right thing may weaken. And that weakening, that negative effect may be so strong that it more than washes away the direct effect of higher rewards or penalties. So that's when you can see a perverse or counterintuitive effect of increasing rewards but getting less good behavior. Now, in the version of the model that we studied last time, that wasn't happening. Yes, we kept the model very, very stark and simple. The only heterogeneity and private information agents have is about the strength of their intrinsic motivation, the strength of their pro-social preference, and that was captured in V. Now, that alone was not giving us this perverse crowding out effect. So what we're going to do is we're going to study another variant of the model where we complicate matters a little bit more. And some of you raised this point, what if we don't know how much people care about their reputation, right? What if we don't know what their cost of doing the right thing is, and so on and so forth. So we'll now introduce another dimension of uncertainty, okay? So, new version of the model, actions are still binary. Let's fix two types. Previously, we had a continuum of types, with V. We'll simplify on that dimension, and we'll say that there are just two types. Generous, let's call one type, and the other type is greedy, right? And the probability that a random person from the population is generous is alpha. So that's the prior. Now, payoff from action 0 is 0. What is payoff from action 1? This is what we'll specify. So for the generous guy, it's V, the intrinsic motivation, minus the cost, plus the reputational payoff. For greedy, it's Y, the income or the reward, minus C plus mu R. So the difference between generous and greedy has been kept very simple and stark. in this version, right? Generous doesn't care about money at all. Notice that Y doesn't enter into generous payoff, the generous person's payoff function. Generous only has some amount of sympathy for others, and some intrinsic motivation, which is pro-social. So that's captured in V. Greedy has basically a V of 0, right? This V is just a number, it's a parameter. Now it's no longer a variable, or rather it's a variable, but one of them has a V of V and the other has a V of 0. So greedy only cares about money, right? Apart from these other things. Also cares about reputation, but cares about money and not about others. And generous cares about others, but not at all about money. So this is admittedly stark. Most people would care about both things, but we'll keep it extreme to make it simple. Now, here's the other dimension. So an onlooker, I am thinking of my neighbor. What kind of person is this? I don't know. That's private information. And this is the difference. Now, as far as this cost is concerned, previously we took it as just one number which applies to everyone. So now we'll bring in a second dimension of uncertainty. Each person may have a low cost CL or a high cost CH of acting pro-socially, right? So if there's a blood donation camp, on that day you may have a lot of free time, so it's not very costly for you to go and donate blood. But you may have some very important appointments and business and interviews and meetings or what have you, in which case your opportunity cost or cost is very high, CH. Okay. Again, if you look at a random person, there's a probability Q that they'll have a low cost and a probability 1 minus Q that they'll have a high cost. And we are going to also assume that the cost is uncorrelated with whether the person is generous or greedy, right? So Q fraction of generous people have low costs. Among the greedy population, again, Q fraction has low costs, right? That's identical. So types and costs are independently drawn and they're private information. I don't know what your cost of giving blood today is, and I don't know whether you're generous or greedy. I have probabilities, right? I think your cost is low with probability Q, and I think you're generous with probability alpha to begin with. Now, when I observe you giving blood or not giving blood, acting pro-socially or not acting pro-socially, I will revise these prior beliefs, this Q and alpha, based on the observation, and that's where all the action in the game is going to arise from. And finally, what is R? R is this difference. This is exactly like before, right? If I see you acting pro-socially, I'll update my belief that you're a generous soul. If I see you not acting pro-socially, then again, I'll update my belief. What's the chance you're generous? And sometimes it may happen that, the chance isn't 0. Maybe you didn't give blood because your cost was high. Maybe you had a lot of important things to do on that day, and it was costly to cancel them. So this difference is R, right? The difference in posteriors, conditional posteriors on generosity, conditional on the actions. Yes? So the model clear to everyone? Any questions? I'll be back in a moment. Just give me 30 seconds. Okay, guys, any questions on the model, its assumptions, its meaning? Yes, Shiva, go ahead.
R again.
What is R? R is exactly what we had in the previous version of the model, right? So uh, in the in equilibrium, um, posterior beliefs will arise, right? So people here care about their image. Image, what image? The image that they're generous people, or they're very likely to be truly generous people, right? With these preferences rather than those greedy preferences. And that's what they're trying to signal, among other things. So since they can choose either an antisocial action and a pro-social action, I shouldn't say antisocial, probably non-social action, some selfish action versus a pro-social action, like donating blood or obeying the rules and helping out others or what have you. Uh, if they choose action zero, there will be some posterior belief of observers, of others, that this is a generous guy. If they choose the other action, which is pro-social, then there will be another posterior belief that this is a generous fellow. The difference in these two beliefs is the reputational gain. Yes. And when we introduce this variation in cost, it introduces some sort of plausible deniability, meaning that, I don't choose the socially pro-social thing. I come late to pick up my kid, or I don't show up at the blood camp and donate blood, etc. Right? If I do that, people will say this is more likely somebody who's a greedy type, who's not a generous type, right? But that belief may not be zero, because they will think that there's some chance that I really had very important things to do, and it was very costly for me to show up today. Okay. Nevertheless, if I do the right thing and people see me doing the right thing, then they'll surely update their beliefs. Instead of a 20% chance of generosity, they might think, oh, I'm 90% chance I'm a generous fellow. And this difference between the 90% and the 20%, this 70% difference is R. Yeah, is that clear? R is how much more likely people think that I am generous if I switch from the zero action to the one action of one. Okay. Um, Again, we'll make some assumptions, some parameter restrictions, which makes it interesting. So when parameters have this sort of configuration, then the results of the model are most interesting, and the kind of effects we are talking about come out. So we'll make that assumptions, right? So what do these assumptions imply? Uh, First, greedy will never contribute without monetary incentives. That's one implication, because mu is less than CL. Okay. Mu is less than CL means, look at greedy's preference. If the Y is zero, and even if R takes its maximum value 1, still this payoff is negative. Okay. So there has to be some monetary reward for greedy to contribute. Uh, Generous always contributes if her cost is low, right? That comes from V being greater than CL, right? Again, if you look at the generous types payoff, uh, even if R is zero, if the cost is low, V is higher than that cost, and so it's worth choosing action one for the generous type when her cost is low. Yeah. Um, when cost is high, generous contributes only if there's enough reputational gain. So, um, so CH is greater than V. That means that when the cost is high, If the reputational gain is zero, then generous will find this payoff negative and he will not act pro-socially, right? So we have chosen the costs to be on the two sides of V, and that makes it certain that the low cost type of generous people will always contribute no matter what. And the high cost types, it is conditional. They'll look at, how much reputational gain I will have. Just the V is not enough, right? They need some more. They need something extra in terms of reputation. Um, and we are also going to assume that um, oh, CH is in between these, right? This last inequality implies or makes sure that if there's a generous agent and his cost is high, if he has enough reputation to gain, then he will act pro-socially. If there's no reputation to gain, he will not act pro-socially. But if there's enough reputation that he can gain, then he will act pro-socially. Now, the bottom line of all of this is simple. There are four types, right? There's a high cost greedy type, there's a low cost greedy type, there's a high cost generous type, and there's a low cost generous type. What these assumptions imply is that we don't have to worry about the behavior of uh, two of these four types. The high cost greedy type will never contribute, right? We'll keep our reward small enough so that is true. So the high cost greedy type will always choose action zero, okay? And the low cost generous type will always choose action one. That's coming out from these assumptions. So if it's a generous person and his cost is low, no matter what happens in the rest of the model, this person will always act pro-socially, action one. If it's a greedy person with a high cost, again, will never act pro-socially. So the only two types whose behavior or whose strategies and choices we have to think about and solve are the low-cost greedy types. The low-cost greedy types might actually act nice if there's enough reputation to gain for them. So those guys, and the other is the high-cost generous types. For the high-cost generous types, just their intrinsic motivation isn't enough. They are looking for some reputational kick, right? They need some minimum reputational kick to act pro-socially and cover for their high cost. All right?
Sir,
Yes,
the high cost greedy never contributes. That is because we are holding Y small enough. So that doesn't
that's
come
right.
from these inequalities, right?
It won't come from these
Yeah.
inequalities, but what do we have to assume? Will you'll see in the analysis I start with y equal to 0 and then gradually increase it, right? And so over the kind of ranges that I'll consider, that's going to be the case,
Okay.
right? We'll have a mixed strategy equilibrium in some ranges where the low cost greedy type will be indifferent between contributing and not contributing. And that would immediately imply that for those values of y, the high cost greedy types will strictly prefer not to contribute because the costs are higher, right? So we'll restrict our attention to those ranges of y. Yeah. If y is very, very high in this model, I mean, just doesn't matter, right? Um, Everyone contributes practically. Uh, well, of the greedy types, there's enough money on the table for them, for all of them to contribute. But we won't get to those high values. Okay, now, what is the nature of the equilibrium? Yeah, so as I just said, we'll start by thinking of y equal to 0, because that's something, can be a part of design in this context, right? The authorities can choose where to set y, the monetary reward. So let's start with 0 and then gradually increase it and see what happens, what kind of equilibrium it brings about. Uh, So there will be basically three range of values of y, right? Um, there'll be a low range starting from 0 up to some cutoff point where, and this cutoff point can be exactly calculated, it's CL minus mu. And oh, before that, let me just say that the kind of equilibrium we're going to consider is, as I said, there are two types of behavior we have to worry about, right? So let's try to construct equilibrium where uh, the um, the low cost, let's try to construct equilibrium where all the generous types, whether low cost or high cost, all of them choose action one. They all act nice, right? Even the high cost ones act nice. And among the low cost ones, now remember that um, uh, um, yes. So we are trying to construct equilibrium where all the generous fellows contribute, all of them. And among the greedy fellows, the low cost ones contribute, but they randomize, right? And sigma is the probability of contribution from the low cost greedy types. Okay. Now, for a low enough range of values, sigma will be 0 actually, right? Because of this assumption. If there's too little money on offer, then even if the low cost guy gets full reputational reward, right? People update their beliefs from 0 to 1, then his payoff is mu. And his cost of acting pro-socially, even if it's low, is more than that, right? So that assumption guarantees that for the low types to start contributing or acting pro-socially, you need some minimum amount of money to be on the table. So region 1 is very, very simple for that reason, right? Now, once we cross a certain threshold, things become interesting, and we get into a region 2 where the high cost generous type still contributes, right? And the low cost greedy type starts randomizing. Some of them start contributing, and that jams the signal to some extent, right? In this range, all the generous fellows act pro-socially, all the greedy fellows act selfishly. So by looking at what people have done, action 0 or 1, we can tell who's which type, right? So identifying the types of people becomes very simple in this range. Once we get into this second range, there's some amount of noise in the signal as far as inference of types is concerned because of this genuine mixed strategy, right? The low-cost greedy types start randomizing. And I'll show you the details. And then if you increase the reward beyond a certain point, what happens is that the low-cost greedy type still randomizes, but the high-cost generous people suddenly stop acting pro-socially and switch to action 0, the selfish action, right? And that switch point is the interesting thing that we want to think about, right? So let me show you the picture. I'll come back to the details here. This is what it looks like, okay? So picture always sort of makes it, helps us wrap our heads around it. So we have fixed the other parameters. They satisfy those inequality assumptions that I mentioned. And now I'm starting from y equal to 0, I'm gradually increasing the reward, the monetary reward, right? Initially, the fraction, the blue line is the fraction of generous people who choose action 1, right? So that fraction is 1, all of them do initially. And Among the greedy people, nobody does. So that is grazing the axis. This is the first switch point. At this point, what happens is all the generous people still keep contributing, including the high cost ones. Among the greedy, some fraction of the low cost ones switch to pro-social actions, A equal to 1, right? And that keeps going up as the size of the reward is increased, right? So things are turning out to be very well in this second range. You put more money on the table, you get more blood donation, you get more, uh, good behavior. The important point is the second switch point. What happens here is that suddenly things switch to the type 3 equilibrium that was in the slides, meaning the high cost among the generous suddenly stop doing the pro-social thing. So this drop, right, drops from 1 to Q. Remember, Q fraction of any population has low cost, right? So among the generous people, only the low cost still contribute, and the high cost ones stop contributing at this point, right? And there's a discontinuous downward jump. And even among the greedy population, there will be a similar downward jump, right? And then once you enter into the second zone, things keep improving again as you increase it. But it's this downward jump which is capturing, our crowding out effect. So if you're on the left of the second threshold, Y2, and you add a little bit more money so that we go to this, into the third zone, then suddenly there's a some degree of collapse of good behavior, pro-social behavior. Overall, things get worse, right? And that's sort of a simple and stark illustration of the crowding out effect that I was talking about. Now, what is the nature of this construction? So let me talk a little bit about the details, having shown you the overall picture. Any questions? Let me mention another thing. I should have shown you the next picture, so let me get to that. So if I plot the value of R, the equilibrium value of R, for various levels of the reward Y, right? Initially, R is 1, obviously. Remember, in that first zone, all the generous people act pro-socially, all the greedy people choose action 0. So if I switch from action 0 to action 1, people will swing completely to the other. And, they were thinking I'm greedy, and now they'll think that I'm generous for sure. So this is the maximal reputation gain. Now, once we enter regions where even some of the greedy types start acting pro-socially, the reputational gain starts weakening. And that makes sense, right? So now we know that some of the people who are acting nice are actually not nice people. They're acting nice because of their concern about images. Deep down, they really don't care about society or others, or they don't, they're actually greedy. So the reputational kick becomes weaker and weaker as more money is put on the table, right? And the reputational kick, that this function will have no discontinuities, including at the point Y2. It will be a continuous function, and it will be monotonically decreasing over here. Yeah. I'll tell you the reason. But having shown you the patterns, let me go back to some of the details of these equilibrium constructions. Let me crack the time. Okay. Now, let's focus on region 2. Yes. Again, this is the region where Y is high enough so that, remember, we are only looking at 2 of these 4 types, the other two types behavior we know already by assumption that those have been kind of fixed. So in this second region, what is happening is that uh, the low-cost genus types are contributing, all of them. Sorry, the high-cost genus types are contributing, all of them. Low-cost contribute anyway. High-cost genus types are contributing, and the low-cost greedy types, some of them are contributing. So in other words, those guys are randomizing by some sigma probability, right? Sigma is the interior. Now, first, exploit this feature that the low-cost greedy guys are randomizing. That means they're indifferent between choosing actions 0 and 1, right? So what does that mean? That means this has to be true, right? So y plus this reputation payoff minus their cost should be equal to 0, because if they don't contribute, they get 0. So this is basically the indifference condition. And from that, we can calculate what the R function has to be. What is the reputation? There's only one value of the reputation gain, which will make these guys indifferent, right? And that is given by this expression immediately. So in equilibrium, in this zone and in the next zone, R has to take this value. If it's any higher, all of these low-cost greedy fellows would like to contribute, would like to be pro-social. And if it's any lower, none of them would want to be pro-social, right? So this is the reputational gain that keeps them indifferent. And since they're randomizing, this has to hold. All right? Now, remember, we want two features to hold. The low-cost greedy types should be randomizing, and the high-cost generous types should strictly prefer to choose action 1, right? So let's focus on that second condition. Right? In this zone, we want these two features to hold. So what does the second condition require? From the second condition, we can derive some threshold value of reputation, R star. All right. What is R star? R star is the value of reputation where the high-cost generous people become indifferent between acting pro-socially or not. And if they anticipate a reputation gain anything less than R star, then they will stop acting pro-socially. If they anticipate anything higher than R star, then they'll have a strict preference. So R star is the minimum reputation gain that they need for them to be pro-social in spite of their high cost, right? And so we can calculate what the value of R star is from their indifference condition, these guys. And so for the whole construction to hold up, that the low-cost greedy people are randomizing and the high-cost generous people strictly want to act pro-socially, we need this R star, we need this equilibrium RY, what will keep the first set of guys, the greedy guys, indifferent. We need that to be above R star, right? R star is the minimum reputation that the high-cost generous people need. So as long as that is guaranteed, our construction in this region 2 will hold up. It will be a valid equilibrium, right? And that means we can just write down the inequality, and that's where we get that's how we calculate that threshold y2. As long as y is less than y2, this relationship will hold, that the equilibrium reputation level, which keeps the greedy people indifferent, will be higher than the reputation that minimum reputation that the generous people need. Okay. Now, what happens when this inequality is reversed? And surely it will be reversed if you keep increasing the reward and hit this threshold, right? After that, if you increase the reward any further, this inequality goes the other way around, and this sort of equilibrium is no longer maintained. That's when we move to region 3. And in region 3, what happens is that um, that collapse that I was showing you in the picture, that happens, right? Um, Now, as I said, excuse me, the Ry function is continuous, right? Whatever else happens in equilibrium, because both in zone 2 and in zone 3, the low cost greedy people randomize. So throughout both of those regions, they have to be indifferent. That means this function has this holds throughout in both the ranges that all the ranges that we're talking about. Well, ranges set 2 and 3. Uh, so that's, let's now go to the picture, right? So as we are offering more money, more reward, reputation in equilibrium will steadily go down. And even if when we cross this threshold, it keeps going down in a continuous way, right? Now, how do we understand this picture? So let me give you the intuition. Uh, as the reward size is getting increased, more greedy people are acting pro-socially. So naturally, reputation is weakening, which is this second picture. The green line is coming down. And as I said, after hitting this threshold, reputation comes down so much, it falls below R star, right? What is R star? R star is the minimum reputation that high cost generous people need in order to be willing to act in a pro-social manner. So the moment the reputation falls below R star, that's when we see this downward jump. Right? The high cost generous people no longer want to contribute because they're not getting enough of an image boost by contributing. Right? Why is there a discontinuous downward jump in the red graph? Because of the following. This function, as I argued, has to be continuous even around y2, around the threshold, right? Now, the reputation function really comes from the ratio of generous among the people who are choosing action 1, the pro-social action. What is the ratio of generous and greedy people? That's where really this rep R comes from, right? What is the composition of the people who are giving blood, who are, helping disabled people cross the streets, et cetera, right? What is the composition of that pool, greedy versus generous? So once we cross the threshold, since the big chunk of generous people drop out from acting pro-socially, to maintain continuity of that R function, a big chunk of greedy people will also have to drop out, right? Otherwise, you cannot maintain a continuous ratio of these two in this club of people who are giving blood, etc. So, so that's the general intuition. There's one expression which is algebraically wrong, the R function which I calculated here. I keep thinking of just correcting it, but I haven't gotten down to it. But in any case, I want you to sort of really understand the intuition of what is going on, right? And hopefully I've been able to give you some sense of that. Any questions?
So you said that when the greedy peoples are leaving the club, so then to maintain the continuous ratio, the like pro social people also be leaving the club, right? To
Yes,
maintain a ratio.
right.
So for that, the ratio should be constant. Not if it is a continuous function, then this shouldn't this may not hold, right? Because the function is continuous and a curve. So why to make a constant ratio?
I'm not saying they have to maintain a constant ratio has to be maintained. Okay. So suppose we are sitting at y2 and then the reward is increased to y2 plus epsilon. Okay. Now, the ratio doesn't have to be constant, but the ratio has to come down in a continuous manner, right?
Okay,
R doesn't have to be constant, but R has to be continuous around this point.
okay,
So if R has to be continuous, that means if a chunk of generous people leave, a chunk of greedy people also has to leave. Not to keep the same ratio as before, but to generate a ratio which is very close to the previous ratio.
okay. Thank you. Got it.
So,
Yes,
so can we just think of this in this manner that if some of the people who are generous is leaving the pool, then automatically the reputation is becoming bad when people are donating. So earlier, a greedy person who was benefiting from that reputation gain is not benefiting now, and hence that greedy person also opts out given his cost.
sure. Sure, that's absolutely right, except that a little more needs to be said, which is that, if a very small fraction of generous people left, not a chunk as captured in discontinuities, but a small fraction,
Yes.
then only a small fraction of greedy people had to leave to balance out things. But the moment a big chunk of uh, generous people leave, a big chunk of greedy people also has to leave, right? So I'm trying to tie up the argument that uh, there's going to be a downward jump because reputation has weakened too much, right? So that part is straightforward. There has to be a discontinuous downward jump because all the high cost people will drop out. From that, it follows intuitively, even if you don't do the math, it follows that uh, a a big chunk of these guys also have to drop out. Because if that weren't the case, if this function was continuous, right, even if it came down, in a continuous fashion, then the moment a chunk of the generous people drop out, what will happen to our R function is that it will discontinuously drop.
Yes. Yes.
And that we can't allow because R has to change. If you have increased the reward slightly to maintain the indifference of the greedy guys, the reputation can only weaken slightly, not by a huge amount, right? So that sort of proof by contradiction will be necessary to argue that uh, this red line also has to have a discontinuous downward jump, right?
Yes.
Now, in the paper, they have a more complicated model, so these rough edges aren't there. So you can these graphs have this thing that it can kind of continuously go up and continuously come down and so on and so forth. But there's lots and lots of bells and whistles. So I made it kind of a little sharp, uh, but much more simplified. So hopefully the point comes across more clearly, right? The broad intuition, if your um, somebody on the street asks you, what is the point here? The point here is that um, when there's no monetary reward for doing good things, people really think very well of you. Your image gets really a boost because you're doing it for nothing. And what monetary rewards do is that it weakens that signal. So now they're paying you a lot and you're doing nice things. It doesn't mean the same as before, right? So people are observers, your friends, family, neighbors, they're kind of wondering, are you doing it for the money or are you doing it for the goodness of your heart? And so your reputation has weakened. And some people may drop out for that reason. Some people, if there were people who had a strong concern about reputation, and that was their driver or one of their big drivers when no money was on offer, some of those people may stop contributing. So then we can see a negative effect, right? And if the negative effect is strong enough, if enough people get demotivated and discouraged because their good acts are not perceived as strongly as before, they are not as clean a signal of their motives and their heart as before. If there are enough of such discouraged good Samaritans, then the overall social effect will be negative. You increase rewards and you get less of aggregate good behavior, right? So the trade-off there is that some people who are not so generous are acting nice now because to capture the money. But many people who were generous and were keen to appear generous may now not do it because the signal has become weaker. And if the second effect is strong enough, it swamps the first effect. And you can see things like, those experiments that we were talking about. Blood donation rates fell, the willingness to accept a nuclear facility went down, the rate of late coming in the daycare centers went up, and so on. Questions?
Sir,
Yes.
so in the UK, as you had shown in the example, that people do not pay money to take blood, or they do not get money if they donate blood.
Right.
So in this diagram, we are seeing that there is an optimal range of rewards, right? That which can generate more donations than if there aren't any reward.
Yes.
So, sir, is there any? So then, why are there certain situations where one would prefer no reward, like even in blood donations, say?
See, I mean, in putting up this model, I'm trying to make a broad and qualitative point, which is that be careful about stacking up the rewards and making it bigger, because sometimes the good behavior may fall. I'm not claiming anything general about, when does it fall, when does it rise. We have identified some elements of the environment which have to be present for this perverse effect to potentially arise, namely intrinsic motivation, for example, and reputational motivations, etc. But now, as you said, this doesn't say that every time you sweeten the deal and increase the reward size, you will get less of good behavior. You may get less of good behavior. Sometimes it may go up, sometimes it may go down, right? There's no reason for us to think in these situations that there'll be a monotonic relationship between size of the reward and the rate of good behavior. So we need to be cautious. Now, if we go beyond, for example, if we increase the size of the reward very much, right? And if we don't keep the models to be so stark, right? I assume that the generous people don't care about money at all, right? But let's throw in a little bit of, maybe they care about money slightly. So there's things are smoothed out a little. Then obviously, if you make the reward very, very big, right? If people are told that, if they come in and give blood on the blood camp day, they'll be paid 1 crore rupees. Surely that will increase blood donation, right? So for rewards of a sufficiently high size, the sheer weight of the monetary incentive will swamp any of these cute effects flying around. So one of the papers in the literature, I don't know if I have referred to it in the syllabus, says, pay enough or don't pay at all, it says. Right? So often the perverse effect would perhaps arise in a lower range of rewards. You go from $0 to $7, you may get less people donating blood, as you see in that experiment. You go from $7 to $7,000, then I guess it'll go up, right?
Yes, sir.
Sir, how does one start off with thinking about what the equilibrium would be? Like this one seems intuitive, but there could be other possible equilibriums, or couldn't.
I'm pretty sure I can rule out other possible equilibria. In general, this is a question that often troubles you guys, that, there's a model, it's not a simple 2 by 2, it's more complicated than that. Some, slightly complicated. And the equilibrium seems very baroque, if you will, meaning it has many moving parts and everything has to be kept right. And I tell you that, okay, it's like this. And then you say, you almost expected that there would be some algorithm, some sort of formula which you can run and that'll spit out the equilibrium. And then your question is, what is the formula? How do I find an equilibrium? The sad answer is that there's no magic solution, right? Unless it's a very simple, finite kind of game. There's no sort of mechanical algorithm to find the equilibrium. However, if you think about it intuitively, it often narrows down the set of possibilities, right? So that when you're looking for equilibria, you can say that, okay, it has to have this structure. And within that structure, then you do some calculations. Now, here, for example, many possibilities rule themselves out right away, right? For example, the behavior of two types, the sort of high cost, greedy types and the low cost generous types. We chose parameters so that we don't have to even worry about the behavior of these two types. So that was shut down right away, right?
Yes.
So that narrows down. Now, yeah, let me not dwell too much on it. I think if you think about it a little bit, you will see that this 1 sigma and 0 sigma structure has to be, it cannot be otherwise. It can't be like, in some range it's 0 sigma. You'll never have this reversed, right? You'll never have a discontinuous upward jump, etc., etc. So, so some of the qualitative structure of the equilibrium, a little bit of reflection often helps you pin it down. But in general, it is true that even for games which don't look that complicated, finding a Nash equilibrium is not easy. For example, there's a famous game called Cornell Plotto's game. Anybody has heard of that?
Yes, sir.
Right? It sounds very simple. What is Satyaki
So,
said yes? What is Cornell Plotto's game? Can you?
sir, if I remember it correctly, sir, there were three places where he could like win a position, war front, and he has to strategically place his like army in two of them, such that he could maximize his payoff. So it was a 3x3 normal form Grimlock structure.
Right. So say there are 3 battlefronts and there are 2 generals. Each general has, let's say, a resource of size 1. Resources are, tanks and soldiers and so on. And they have to allocate their total resource of 1 across the 3 battlefields. And in each battlefield, whoever has placed more resources there is the winner. Yes.
Yes, sir.
And the overall game, I win the overall game if I win a majority of these battlefields. If I win 2 or 3, then I'm a winner. If I only win 1 and the other general has won 2 of the battlefields, then I lose out in the war overall. Simple game, right? It's notoriously difficult to find the mixed strategy equilibrium of this game. Yeah. And there's lots of papers which have been written. This and similar games. So yeah, there's no magic formula, right? That's why we have to think. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about going back to experimental papers and so on, there's a paper by Dan Ariely and others. So they asked their subjects to do some tasks, solve a puzzle, type a bunch of letters from looking at a text without making mistakes, counting some beans, etc. These. So some of the tasks required motor skills. It was not taught. It was like, with your hands, but you have to be quick to perform well. And some other tasks involved creativity and memory and thinking, like solving puzzles, logical puzzles, etc. So they did it in Madurai with villagers there. And there were 3 treatments, okay? And the treatments differed by the size of the prize, right? So people who scored above a certain cutoff in these tasks, they won a prize. Now, in one group, the prize was 400 rupees and another 40 rupees. And in the third group, it was just 4 rupees, right? So a very small prize, a medium-sized prize, and a big-sized prize. And the big-sized prize was actually pretty big. It was equivalent of, at the time, 2009, it was like, close to the per capita monthly consumption. So it was one household member's monthly consumption, almost. One of the criticisms of many of these experimental papers is that the stakes are so small that the subjects don't take it seriously. Now, in the high level, this 400 rupee treatment case, that can't be said, right? That's a pretty high stake. Maybe not for us, but for the people who are the subjects in the experiment. Okay. And the sort of things were also graded. So if somebody did very good, which was some threshold, above a certain threshold, then they got the full reward. If they did just about good, then they got half reward. And if they were, these very good, good, bad were concretely defined, and bad performance earns 0. So there were 2 versions. One was in India, in Madurai and all. Another version of a similar experiment was done in America on college students in top universities, MIT and Chicago, right? There also, they were divided into high prize and low prize groups. And they, in some cases, they were tested for sort of puzzle solving, cognitive tasks, and in some cases for just things like, just mechanically typing. How many words can they type per minute, etc. So here's the thing. So what would you expect? It's according to standard sort of theory, that performance will improve if, other things equal, the size of the prize is increased. As we go from 4 to 40 to 400, you will see an upward curve in terms of performance, in terms of what percentage of the subjects manage to have very good performance, for example. Now, here's the overall, I think, the aggregated across all treatments. This is curve. So as you go from low reward, like 4 rupees to 40 rupees, it goes up slightly. But when you go from 40 rupees to 400 rupees, in the group which was given the biggest prize, performance actually drops, and drops quite significantly. Right? It's kind of more than halved. And this drop, now if you cut up the data, what they found in this paper is that this drop actually occurs in those tasks which involve cognitive alertness. So in the puzzle solving part of the experiment, the MIT and Chicago students, or the subjects in Madurai, their performance dropped when low rewards were replaced by high rewards. That's the surprising part. In the motor skills part, when people were asked to count, beans or type words. There, if you increase the reward, performance goes up, it doesn't go down, right? Only in those tasks which require concentration and thinking, going to high levels of rewards leads to the counterintuitive effect. So what does that tell us?
People tend to malfunction under pressure on cognitive tasks.
Yes, but in a particular way, right? In a particular way, which is that, the two sort of explanations and stories that we have talked about so far, they involve things like reputation, right? That if there's more money on offer, uh, I care about my reputation, the Benebucci paper that I just talked about. First of all, on a priori grounds, I can easily imagine, it's very plausible to say that in certain kinds of actions like donating blood, which are quite obviously reflects on a person, right? A person's generosity and goodness. Solving some puzzles or uh, counting some beans is very difficult to connect it to those kinds of reputational motives, right? You may want to be perceived as smart, but not as a good person. Just because you can type a lot of words in a minute, nobody thinks that you're a very uh, generous soul. Um, so that sort of explanation goes out of the window. But what this is saying is that when the reward is high, there's plenty of motivation to do well, to earn that money. And in simple mechanical tasks, that comes out. But perhaps people get stressed out. And we intuitively all identify with this, right? Um, Something that is said of great sports people is that they were calm under pressure. All the Mahendra Singh Dhonis. In the big matches, they could play their big innings because they didn't get nervous and stressed out and faltered for that reason. Um, so that's another reason why very high rewards can be counterproductive, right? It makes the agent very jittery that, oh, what if I fail? The cost of failure is very big. And that thought sort of stands in the way of success. So let me sum up what we have found. So these experiments that I was talking about, on the face of it, when you first run into them, the results are kind of bizarre, right? More money on the table, behavior goes south. Why? So we have discussed a number of potential explanations by looking at theoretical models. The first one is domain switching. That's not very interesting. It's not a very rich explanation. One was negative signal of worth, that if more incentives are offered, people may think that there's a reason they're being offered. Maybe their prospect of success is not as high as they initially thought. Maybe the cost is much more unpleasant and costly than what they initially thought, and so on and so forth. So the incentive may be bad news. The fact that somebody's trying to incentivize you with money may tell you something negative about the nature of the task. The second explanation we saw is signaling pro-social motives, right? This is the reputation story of Benebucci, that yes, the money is bigger, and that in itself is a reason for me to work harder. But then people might think I'm doing it for the money, and so my reputation is not going to improve as much. No, that's this part, right? And then finally, we saw the choking under pressure kind of, explanation. Questions?
Sir,
Yes.
what were the results for MIT and Chicago students? Like, were they same as that of Madurai?
Yes. Right. So the problems crop up in the cognitive tasks part, not in the mechanical motor skills part. There you increase the reward, I mean, performance improves, or at least doesn't go down, right? They had other variations there. For example, when you're asked to solve these puzzles and what is on offer is not a big sum of money, but there's lots of observers, right? So I think there was a variant. You can look up the details in the paper, and pardon me if I get things slightly wrong, but from my recollection was one kind of line was, okay, forget money, no money is being offered. But in one group, people do it in a room and nobody knows how they did. And in another variant, there's lots of onlookers. And when there's lots of onlookers in the cognitive problem solving, puzzle solving kind of things, performance drops. But in the typing, mechanical tasks, it doesn't. So all of that suggests that when the task involves concentration on thinking, any kind of high reward, whether it be money or a crowd watching how you're doing, all of that could sort of make you perform worse.
Sir,
Yes.
could one think of models in which individuals can opt for rewards or opt out? Because that would be another signal, right? So you could either opt for a reward, you could be a good type but have a high cost.
Absolutely. It's a very good question, Arnav. Are there models? I'm sure there are models. I'm trying to remember what I have read. Uh, See, one, so there's a literature which has emerged. Um, Besley and Cutter, they wrote a paper on motivated agents, which is carrying forward these sorts of ideas that some agents have the belief in that mission, right? Um, and so they have intrinsic motivation. Now, when employers, organizations who want to hire people, they are employing them, uh, they have to worry, obviously, what kind of contracts they draw up. Um, and they have to worry about various aspects of it. One is that uh, you may want to create contracts and terms of employment so that you get the motivated people and not the ones who would do it for the money. So selection or screening becomes one of your problems. And then once you've hired a bunch of people, sort of giving them the right incentives and motivation becomes another problem, right? So we haven't talked about the screening problem in whatever we have discussed. So all these aspects come around, right? Now, so in those papers like Besley, Ghatak, and some of the spin-offs, they are worrying about the principal deciding what kind of contract, and also in this framework, right? Now you're saying that what if the agent chooses whether he can, so there are jobs which are very bonus oriented and there are jobs which have more of a flat salary component. What if the agent can choose between these things, right? Yes, that's a very interesting question. And um, one of the things you can do is, Arnav, is that you can survey this and do a presentation for us, right, in that option where you give us the answer to these questions. I'm happy to give you, references and all that. Yeah.
Okay, sir, I'll write to you about this.
Yeah. See, none of, like, related to what Arnav was just saying, see, this is very important. eh, um, there are jobs like, doctors, health workers, maybe teachers, I don't know, where you do want people who, to some extent, care about what they're doing. It's very difficult to sort of just, uh, doctors and nurses in particular, right? Uh, Especially like, in current times, right? And the kind of things you want, the kind of service we are expecting of them is really of a very high standard, right? Um, we want a lot of dedication, and there are lots and lots of people who do it, right? But one of the problems for society is to select the right kind of people. When I graduated with a master's from uh, Delhi school, like you guys are studying, right? This was before the Sepoy Mutiny, you might say, many, many years back. Um, there weren't too many options after a master's, right? So a lot of people applied to graduate school for PhD programs because, there was a sense that if somehow you could get to America with a student visa, getting entry into a PhD program, you will drop out and, then have a good life in America. Um, Nowadays, the situation is very different, right? It's almost, so those days, even if you didn't want to do a PhD and want to apply to graduate school, since there was a prize for it, just in terms of earning opportunities, many people wanted to go there. These days, should I say there's almost a penalty for it, money-wise? Maybe. I mean, the corporate salaries are so high, and you guys have all this placement cell and all the all these big corporates coming and offering you big pay packages. There was nothing like it then. So these days, you're, at least for a horizon of the next 5 years, let's say, you're making a lot of monetary sacrifices if you enter a PhD program. Now, in some ways, that's a good thing, because only if you're really very keen about it and have a strong intrinsic interest in getting into a PhD, only then will you come in. So, if you take our very valuable professions like doctors and nurses, for example, on the one hand, we want to reward them very highly, right? Because they're providing a kind of service to society which is um, invaluable. But we also have to worry about um, not making it too attractive, because then many people will want to enter these professions who don't have the altruism and the fellow feeling that we expect people to have. So yeah, there's a whole vast array of interesting questions that you can think of related to this. Other questions? Okay, I had a little bit of extra stuff after this, but I think I talked about it in the micro lecture. Did I talk about this book by this philosopher, Michael Sandel, called uh, Why Everything Shouldn't Be for Sale, Markets and Morals? Anybody remember? Some of this stuff I talked about. Right? I mean, the basic question is, what kind of transactions and social interchange should be left to markets, and for what kind of things should we rely on non-market methods to allocate things or to conduct exchange, right? I mean, there are obvious examples like, of course, certain things can't be bought, or put a price on, or you can't transact it. You can't say, oh, I'm looking for friendship or love or respect. I'm willing to pay, right? You cannot earn people's respect by paying them big words of money. So these things are obviously cannot be monetized and marketed. Then there are markets which has always been controversial. There are various issues. You guys are aware as master students, sweatshop labor, child labor, prostitution, kidney sale, organ sales, etc. Right? Should we, how much should we clamp down? I mean, should we allow markets for organ sales? That's sort of upping the ante beyond blood donation, right? It makes it more stark. And so in this book, Michael Sandel sort of says that of late is particularly critical of America, but also global culture, that that markets are very nice for allocate, maybe for, I don't know, vegetables and computers, but for many of these kinds of things, there has been an encroachment of markets and market culture and monetization, which he thinks has been bad for society, right? And if you read the book, he has basically two broad points. One is what he calls corruption. He says that certain things, their value diminishes if you marketize and monetize it, and then, and the other is a point about inequality. So he says that, we may tolerate inequality in certain domains for certain kinds of goods, who cares? But for very fundamental goods like, healthcare, for example, or education, we may be sort of more egalitarian than usual, right? We may want those goods and services to be much more equal access than other things. Now, the corruption point which Michael Sandel makes in his book is precisely or very much what we have been talking about through these two Benagutirol papers. What you see there exactly is this, that sometimes when you increase the price of something, its worth diminishes. Yes. And that can be counterproductive. This doesn't happen for apples and computers, but it happens for the kind of things that we have been talking about. So weirdly enough, there's a lot of criticism and broadside against economists in this philosopher's book. But when he's talking about this corruption point, I mean, almost all the studies he's citing, like the daycare center experiment, for example, they're all papers from economics journals, right? So it's there's a interdisciplinary kind of tension there, which is sort of funny. All right. Any questions? There's a little model after this, which is there in the slides. I'm not going to talk about it, right? If we have time later, I can come back to these issues and maybe give you a different version from this model or this version, which I have. Right now, I'm leaving it out here. Any questions, guys? Okay, so I will end today's session. As I said, I'll post this video and another video for next week. I'm going to send you the lecture slides for the next topic, which is on communication or cheap talk. Yeah, so that's what we'll start next time. Okay, goodbye.